name is Britt Sutton, and I'm with Parrish Construction, and we are glad to be here today and just want to welcome y'all to today's event. And as y'all saw in that video, we have a philosophy at Parrish of we build great. And obviously a big part of that is we build great schools and great healthcare facilities and municipal facilities. But the other part of it is we build great communities. And that's why being part of the Robbins Chamber and sponsoring events such as this is such a big part of our company, and one thing that we just love to give back to the communities that we live and work in. So just on behalf of Parrish, we're excited to sponsor this and looking forward to some great information about the housing outlook in Middle Georgia. So thank y'all.
Welcome to the stage our 2024 Chamber Board Chair, Michael Collins with Total Computer Solutions.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Outlook series on housing. I'm honored to represent TCS as the board chair this year, and I'm excited about the content that we have for you today as business community and community leaders. With an adult son still living under my roof, this topic is of special interest to me personally, because that boy's got to go. Just kidding, I love my son. But seriously, housing is an important issue that impacts every person in this room, both personally and professionally. And to name a few, it impacts business recruitment and retention, the economic stability and growth of our region, community development, and business investment. In other words, housing is a topic that is crucial for our business climate. And today we have an expert panel to help us explore where we are and shed light on the factors impacting housing in our state and in our region. I've been tasked this morning with leading us in prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance, so I'd like to ask everyone, if they're able, to please stand. Let's pray. Father and Almighty God, we bow before you today humbled and honored that you would even hear our prayer. You who spoke the world into existence and all there is, care enough to listen to our prayers. Help us, O Father, to focus on the blessings we enjoy around us each day. We're so thankful for this community to which you've entrusted us. May we steward it in a way that every single person who lives here benefits. Help us to be an example of how to do community well. Help us to understand the importance of participating in our local economy and how that participation enhances our personal and professional lives. May we honor you and glorify you in the things that we do and say here today. We thank you for the food prepared for us today and the ones who prepared it. May you use that food to enable us to do your will. We pray all this in the name of your dear Son, Jesus Christ, unto whom is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. You may be seated. Before I exit, I'd like to thank our sponsors this morning. Our host sponsor this morning is obviously Houston Healthcare. We're appreciative of their continued sponsorship. Our series sponsor is Parrish, who we just heard from. Our supporting sponsor this morning is Kim Hamlin Group of Alcova Mortgage. Our session sponsor is Coldwell Banker Free Realty. Let's give all of them a hand. And now I'd like to ask one of our directors, Scott Free, to come forward for some sponsor remarks for Coldwell Banker Free Realty.
Hey, I'm Scott Free with Coldwell Banker Free Realty. We actually have several different companies under our umbrella. We got Coldwell Banker Coldwell Banker Free Realty, which is our residential sales. We have a relative new company. We've been selling commercial land for many years, but we are now franchised through Coldwell Banker worldwide as called Coldwell Banker Commercial. It's called the Free Group. And we also have a rental management company, Richardson Free Realty, which we've had for many years. We manage and leasing rental property. Thank all y'all for being here today. We got a lot to discuss, and with all that, we're gonna show a little video, and we'll get to it. Thank you.
Do you see it? Do you see the potential? The potential for birthday parties on the patio. The potential for lazy weekends by the pool. Do you see the rain hitting the glass as you read a book with a cozy blanket on a cold winter's day? And do you see the science project being done on the kitchen table? Do you feel it? Do you feel the excitement of Christmas morning as the kids race down the stairs and as a family forms memories that can never be replaced? Do you hear it? Hear the crackle of the fireplace, the laughter coming from the next room, the sound of crickets as you call it a night. At Coldwell Banker, our people and our company are cut from a different cloth. We see, hear, feel, and sense things that others simply don't. Perhaps that's because we have a unique appreciation for this magical thing that defies description, but goes by the name of home. Because of this appreciation, and because of our dedication to be the best in the craft, our company has thrived for well over a century. This is why we're ranked #1 in Agent Trust. And this is why more people have turned to us to help them find and sell their homes than any other company in the history of America. We are Coldwell Banker. We do real estate differently. We do real estate with higher standards. And we have proudly guided people home since 1906.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Robbins Regional Chamber President, April Bragg.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us for today's Outlook. This series is something I look forward to throughout the year, and I want to give a quick shout out to the team in the back. Shannon and the folks with Tasting in the Borough provided our delicious lunch today. Y'all give them a round of applause. They got 200 plus people through in about the span of 22 minutes, which is no small feat. So we're grateful to have them serving with us today. So, as most of you know, our Outlook series is designed to provide you with content-rich data and insight from state experts on topics that are relevant and timely to our region. Our goal for this series is for you to walk away with information and inspiration to make the decisions to lead your business and organization into the future. Many of you probably know because we tout it every chance we get, but in the first quarter of this year, Georgia was once again named the best state in which to do business for an unprecedented 10 years in a row. Over the last 5 years, the state has experienced year-over-year record economic growth from over 2,000 projects locating in the state of Georgia, with significant job creation and over 70% of which are outside of Metro Atlanta. This incredible success means communities across the state of Georgia, like ours, are facing the unique challenges that must be met with innovative solutions in order to fully capitalize on the economic opportunities. This also means many Georgians are not able to often work in the communities they call home, and impacts our ability to retain and attract talent. Today's program, much like our Small Business Outlook in May, will feature some of our state experts giving formal presentations, followed by a panel discussion, including them and some of our local decision makers as well. We're going to open things up with Dominic Purvance. Dominic is a subject matter expert with the Atlanta Fed in the Supervision and Regulatory Division, followed by Chris Stinson, Director of Policy and Research for the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. Please welcome Dominic.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Is it afternoon? Almost afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here again. I do a lot of presentations throughout the year. This is the only time where I actually get walk-up music, which is pretty cool. I appreciate it. So again, my name is Dominic Purviance. I'm a subject matter expert in residential real estate at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. I generally am responsible for developing residential real estate analytics that we use in banking supervision. I also am responsible for doing a considerable amount of outreach to our stakeholders and talking about everything that we do in housing. In my capacity, I'm also responsible for developing the Homeownership Affordability Monitor, which we'll talk about a little bit more in our presentation today. So without any further ado, okay, there we go. So I have to give a little bit of disclaimer that my views don't necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the Federal Reserve Board of Governors or the Federal Reserve System. They are my views. And I will say, as most of you know, that the Federal Open Market Committee just concluded its meeting this week, and they, as most of you in here know, they've decided to not make any cuts to interest rates. Typically around when the FOMC meets, we try not to overshadow anything that they say after the meeting. So I'll try to keep my overall economic views relatively brief and kind of refer back to some of the statements that were made out of the FOMC. So this is our roadmap and our brief time together today. I'm going to give sort of a very brief economic backdrop. We will talk about mortgage rates, which has a direct impact on the housing market. I'll talk about some of the market conditions in this region. I'll focus on home prices and housing affordability, and then I'll provide some of my conclusions. So you can't see this chart from your seat. I think you'll get a copy of this. So you'll have a copy of this presentation, so you can kind of examine all the numbers here. So what this is showing you is the components of inflation. And so the column all the way to the left there is the overall total CPI inflation number. And so all of the subsequent columns are all of the different components that make up CPI. And so what you're able to do when you have some time, you can see which components are actually driving inflation. As you know, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, full employment, and 2% inflation target. We're not yet at that 2% target. This chart shows us around 3%. Some measures have us a little bit lower than 3%, but remember that 2% is the target. It doesn't mean that the Fed won't lower rates until we hit that target, but it does mean we want to see inflation getting pretty much closer to that target before there's a change in monetary policy. I have outlined here the component of inflation called shelter. Shelter includes all housing. You can see the shelter component is much higher than some of the other components of inflation. It has been moving down, but it has been the one component of inflation that's remained relatively sticky. So this next chart breaks out the those different components that make up shelter. See the black line there is the overall CPI. You can see it's at 3%. You can see it jumped up closer to 9%. You can see it declined through most of last year. The beginning of this year it flattened, and so that was a little bit of a concern. It's why if you read some of the correspondence from Chair Powell and the FOMC members, it's why they decided to not necessarily raise rates anymore, but also not to lower them until we started to see inflation started to move down. And typically monetary policy takes a little bit of time to work itself out through the economy. It's good to see us moving a little bit closer. You can see the last few months inflation is starting to move down after stalling from the beginning part of this year, so that's overall positive. The two components of inflation that comprise of shelter, the two most important components are rent of primary residence and the owner's equivalent rent. And you can see both of those are much higher than that core CPI. but both of them are moving in the right direction. So hopefully, as we continue to make progress on inflation, we'll see monetary policies start to be less restrictive. No promises though. So in terms of employment, the overall economy has done great, which is a little bit of surprise given that we do have very high inflation, but we've had higher inflation sort of adjusting back towards that 2% target, but it hasn't really had a significant impact on job growth, both nationally and locally. So the green bars here represent the job growth in this region, and the lines here represent the different wage sectors of growth. And so you can see the red line there is the high wage sectors. The yellow and the blue and yellow lines are the mid and low range sectors. So you can see we have experienced pretty significant, pretty steady job growth in the region, but most of that growth is concentrated in your lower or mid-range sectors. The job growth in the higher range sectors has been a little bit more muted. All right, you move to the next slide. All right, so another chart that's probably straining your eyes, but you will have an opportunity to look at it when you get a copy of the presentation. What we're looking at is the different components of consumer credit quality, and I will bring your attention to and we're looking from 2019 all the way through second quarter of this year, and so this just shows the trend in delinquencies. And so you can see a couple areas are a little bit of concern. The consumer financing is the highest. You see that big spike in delinquencies around 16%. You can see also credit card utilization as well as credit card delinquencies a little bit elevated. Some good news here, mortgage delinquencies are relatively low and student loan delinquencies are relatively low. We do have also an increase in retail delinquencies over on the right-hand side of the chart. So what this is telling us is as inflation increased, consumers had a little bit of difficulty making their payments. They use their credit cards a little bit more frequently. They have increased stress because of inflation, so we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in some areas of consumer credit quality. You go to the next slide. I don't think my clicker is working here. All right, so the all-important mortgage rates. And so what you're seeing is the history of the 30-year fixed mortgage rates going back to 1972. You can see during each decade how the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate has changed. The box there shows you where we were as of earlier this week at 6.8%. What I like to point out in this chart, if you go over the entire history, if you just look at what the long-term average of 30-year fixed interest rates are, it's somewhere around between 7.5% and about 7.25%. That's the long-term average. And what I hear pretty often is people say, well, today interest rates are plus or minus 7%. They've been floating around there since last year. You go back to the 1990s, we had much higher interest rates, even in the early 2000s, we had much higher interest rates. Why are people complaining about 7% interest rates? When I bought my first house, it was 9%, and I was happy with it. I hear that all the time. But the difference is, today there is a stark difference between where incomes are relative to home prices than where they have been historically. And so, historically, if you just take that price to income ratio, if you just take the average home price divided by incomes, it's normally around 4.5%. About 4.5 is the ratio. Today, the ratio to home prices to incomes are now over 6. And so that means the average home price is now 6 times incomes, where it used to be somewhere around 3 to 4 times incomes. And what that means is, if you think about the components of affordability, which we'll talk about in a second, you have incomes, home prices, and interest rates. If home prices have increased at a faster rate than incomes, then that's going to create a problem with affordability. And any kind of marginal change in interest rates now has a more dramatic impact on affordability. because the price to income ratio is much different than where it was historically. So although, you know, we are really below the long-term average in terms of mortgage rates, higher mortgage rates today have a more detrimental impact to housing affordability than they've ever had before, mostly because home prices have increased at a faster rate than incomes. I will mention non-principal interest costs like taxes and insurance, HOAs, those are also factors, not as much as a factor here as it is in states like Florida, where we've seen homeowners insurance increase at a significant rate, right? All right, I'm working now. Yep. So if you look at so interest rates are plus or minus 7%. We've seen a spike in interest rates as the FOMC has been dealing with inflation. And so what impact has that had on home sales? So you can see that black line is the total sales volume in the region. The bars there represent the year-over-year change in sales. So you can see when interest rates went close to 7%, we saw a dramatic decline in sales in the region. The sales dropped around 30% overall in this region in Warner Robins when interest rates spiked. So you're seeing sales sort of improve a little bit, but we're still 12% down from where we were a year ago. And I will say, if you think about, maybe not so much in this region, but nationally, in 2008, we had a 30% decline in sales, and that had a dramatic impact on home values in the housing market. But we're not seeing the same impact with this decline in sales as we saw previously for a very important reason. So the next slide shows you what's happening with home prices. Right, so sales declined by 30%. The bars here represent the year-over-year change. The line there represents the median home price. So median home prices continue to rise. We're just talking about existing home prices. I'll show you the difference between new and existing in just a second. So we're right about $250,000, the median in the region for existing homes. You can see that the increase in home prices in 2022, we peaked at about 20% year-over-year increase. That's a historic rise in home prices in this region. It's on par with the increase in home prices we saw nationally. So even though, and so you see the rate of increase has declined as sales have declined, but we have not gone negative. That means home prices have not declined, even though sales have declined by 30%. And that is, you know, in looking at data for the past 20 years, that's something that you would not expect to see. If you told me that home sales would decline by 30%, I would tell you that you'll see a subsequent decline in home prices. We're not seeing that. And the reason why you're not seeing that is because we just don't have enough inventory. And so before I talk about that, I'll show you the difference between new and existing home prices. So you can see historically the gap between new and existing home prices is always a gap there. Since the 2008 crisis, that gap has widened. You see where we are today. The median existing home price is around $250,000, and the new home price is much higher, well over $300,000 for the region. So I mentioned inventory. So this chart shows you exactly what's been happening in the region. So the bars there represent the overall amount of inventory that's for sale in the region. The line there is the month supply of inventories. The month supply of inventory is how many months it would take to absorb the current amount of inventory given the current rate of absorption. And so that the gray line bar that goes through the middle of that chart is what we consider a balanced inventory level. So that's between 4 to 6 months supply. So anything above 6 is considered oversupplied, anything below 4 is considered undersupplied. You can look at that blue line, it's been, for the past several years, it's been well below 4 months supply. And today, it's about 1.7 months of supply. And so I will tell you, anything below 4 is a shortage, anything below 2 is a severe shortage of inventory. So you can see the overall level, we had over 1,000, 1,200 units of inventory available for sale in the market. Now we have about 500 units for sale. And so that represents a significant shortage. Why is there low levels of inventory? For 2 reasons. One is because there's a considerable amount of homeowners that have locked in a mortgage at like a 3% rate or lower, and there's no reason why they would ever sell. So there's a disincentive as people locked into a low rate mortgage, there's a disincentive for people to sell. So even though sales have declined, inventory has also declined because fewer people are listing their homes on the market. The other reason is because we're just not seeing the rate of new home construction that we would need to see, certainly at more affordable price points, in order to make up the imbalance of inventory. So the other way to kind of look at inventory is the share of homes that sell above the asking price. Typically, if there's a shortage of inventory, that means supply exceeds demand, demand exceeds supply. And so if you put a house on the market, you may get more offers above the asking price. So that's what this measure tries to show. And even though the share of homes that sell above the asking price or above the list price is higher nationally than it is in this region, the trend still follows the national trend. And if you look at where we are today, about 25% of units that are on the market sell above the asking price. Historically, it's been around 10% of units selling above the asking price. So that's indicative of a market that just has a shortage of inventory. So what effect has all of this had on housing affordability? So this is a measure that we track. Housing affordability for us is measured by how well the median income household can afford the median price house. So you see the top line is the national and the bottom line is Warner Robins. And what's the threshold? The threshold for affordability is 30% of income. So if your total housing costs, taxes, insurance, and principal and interest payment exceeds 30% of your income, housing is considered unaffordable for the median income household. If it's below 30%, it's considered affordable. So you can see historically this region has been very affordable. I'll show you in a second, it's still one of the it's not one, it's the most affordable region in the entire state of Georgia. But what's happened over the past year is the cost of owning a home just crept a little bit above that 30% threshold. So we're about at 30.1%. So that means technically by our definition of affordability, this region is no longer affordable if you make the median income. So just comparing where we are to other regions in the state, so Warner Robins is still the most affordable region in the state of Georgia. That's not just because housing is cheap here, it's because incomes are higher here relative to other parts of the state. So if you look at the median price of a house in Warner Robins, it's about the same as it is in a city like Valdosta. But the difference is incomes are much higher, and so that means that if you make the median income here, you're more likely to be able to afford the median price house relative to any other region in the state. But it just is slightly above that 30% threshold, and that's why technically by our definition, the region is unaffordable. So another way to look at it is, another way to look at affordability is the gap between the income needed to afford the median price house and the income and the actual incomes in the region. So that blue line is the actual incomes. The orange line is represents the incomes that the income you would need to make in order to afford the median price house. You can see for a long period of time, if you make the median income, you make more than enough to afford the median price house. But over the past few years, the combination of an increase in home prices and an increase in interest rates has sort of closed that gap, which I call the affordability gap. And so that gap is sort of narrowed, so that just narrowly above what you would need to make the actual incomes are just narrowly below what you would need to make in order to afford the median price house. Again, if you compare, you go to the next slide. Okay, there it is. So if you compare to other regions in the state, so the orange bar represents the income that you would need to make to afford the median price house. The blue bar represents actual incomes, and the gap between the two is what I call the affordability gap. You can look at almost every region in the state, that gap is significantly wide. Warner Robins is just a tiny gap. So it's probably a couple $100 difference between actual incomes and what we call the qualified income you need to in order to afford the median price house. So lastly, just looking at what affordability looks like in different zip codes in the region, because all parts of the region are not necessarily as affordable as the others. So you can see a couple of zip codes, 31005 to 31047, are probably the most unaffordable parts of the region. In both of those regions, the median existing home price is above $300,000. 31091 is, so you sort of have to take that with a caveat. There are very few home sales in the zip code. And so over the past, we use a 3-month moving average. And so over the past 3 months, there was maybe a few very expensive properties that sold, kind of driving the median price up. So you sort of have to take it with a grain of salt. I did get a question about why Perry wasn't on here. And so when I looked at the data, the median price of a home, of existing home that's sold in the past 3 months is about $270. And the median income is about $73,000. So that would make it technically still affordable based on our measure. Right. So I'll close with some conclusions, and we'll bring up our next speaker, and then I'll look forward to being on the panel. And so despite the diminished demand, home prices continue to rise due primarily to a sustained housing shortage in the region. And I gave those two reasons, that rate lock effect, meaning that so many people are locked into a low rate mortgage, so they're disincentivized to sell. Rising home prices and elevated interest rates have led to a deterioration in affordability in the regions. It's not a surprise. Critically low inventory levels remain really the biggest challenge for the housing market, not just here, but the housing market everywhere. I will say one of the things that we're seeing in other regions, we are seeing inventory starting to pick up, and that's mostly because there are people that really have to sell because they get married or divorced or downsizing or whatever. We're just not seeing that same trend occur here. Like other markets, we're seeing nationally inventory is up about 20%. Inventory in this region is still down, and that's primarily because of the rate lock effect and the inability to deliver new product. So with that, I'll turn it back over to April. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and it's good to be back. I was last here in November of 2022, and y'all always have a great turnout, so glad to be here speaking today. But my name is Chris Denson. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. We're a nonprofit think tank located in Atlanta. We focus on state economic issues, and we were founded in 1991. And during that time, we worked on education issues, healthcare, transportation, criminal justice reform, and we had never actually started working on housing until 2021. And during that time, we started getting questions about why is housing so unaffordable for so many Georgians? And so up here, you'll see on the screen where we really set out to try and speak with a wide range of stakeholders in the housing industry before we started working on this issue. I had this anecdote. In 2018, the Georgia State House had a meeting of the House Rural Development Council in Gainesville. And it was there where a lady stood up and said that she was from LJ and they did not have workforce housing in LJ. For those of you who may not be familiar, we're talking about a city of roughly 2,500 people and a county of 30,000 people. And she said, I have workers that are traveling over an hour to get to work in LJ. They cannot afford to live here. And so that was the real canary in the coal mine in terms of, despite what you may see in the news or watch on television, this is not just a Metro Atlanta issue. This is a statewide problem we're facing. And so in 2019, the State House launched the Committee on Workforce Housing, and you'll see here they identified the 4 L's, which were the drivers of housing costs. And those were the cost of labor or workforce, cost of land, cost of lumber or building materials, and the cost of laws or regulations. In 2022, that committee met again in a revised form, and they added a fifth L, which you heard Dominic outline. Lending was now the fifth driver of unaffordability of housing as interest rates began to rise. It's just some data that I provide to talk about why we're having such an issue with really the lack of inventory and how that drives the lack of affordability. As you'll see here, in the 2000s, Georgia issued permits for over 800,000 homes statewide. During the 2010s, that number had decreased to just above 386,000. So from one decade to the next, we had a decrease of 52% in the terms of building permits that were issued, despite adding 1 million new residents during that time period. And so when you think about the lack of housing, we're not just simply trying, we're not falling behind. We've been trying to play catch up for a significant time now. I pulled some data from the census to provide a perspective on what we're looking at here in the region. The MSA for Warner Robins is both Houston and Peach counties. They used to include Pulaski in there, so the data is somewhat skewed. But you'll see here that the trend locally is the same we're seeing statewide. And then you had a decrease of just over 15% in terms of building permits issued from the 2010s, from the 2000s to the 2010s, despite adding roughly the same percentage in terms of new residents to the region. And I should have mentioned earlier, everything that I'm sharing today, it's all public information or it comes from our own research and reports, and I'll share that with April. And so I'm going through a lot of information quickly, but you'll have all this at the end of the day if you'd like to go back and review anything. In August of 22, the U.S. Senate issued a report looking at the amount of housing units that were short nationwide, and they broke it down by each state. You'll see this figure they have here is nearly 365,000 housing units short in the state of Georgia compared to the population. And so all that data is to show that right now our fundamental issue in the housing market is the lack of supply. And so when I go around the state speaking about this, almost assuredly I get a question about how do we regulate and keep the big banks or the institutional investors from buying homes? They run above market rates, and almost assuredly everyone seems to have experience in their neighborhood with at least one big bank coming in and buying a home and renting it for about 150% or above the market rate. And I think it goes back to this lack of supply we're seeing. Georgia's become a very popular destination to move to, and so our population is surging. We're not building housing to accommodate, and so we have this lack of supply. And now banks, quite frankly, are treating housing, especially in Georgia, like a precious commodity. So I put this Wikipedia slide up here because workforce housing is probably the popular term across the state right now for the type of housing we need, especially in a chamber meeting. If you go to this Wikipedia page, nowhere in here will you actually see a definition for what workforce housing is. Now, a lot of communities try to define it as based on the needs of the workforce. Obviously, that's where you get workforce housing. A lot of times you'll see them try to tie it to the area median income. Sometimes they'll just try to set it at on a certain, X, no housing above X price point, but there's really no answer. There's no definition for the problem, so it makes it more difficult to try and come up with a one-size-fits-all answer when you don't have a definition for the problem. When I was talking with April ahead of time, she mentioned that y'all are focused on income-aligned housing. And I think that's smart. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about this during the panel, but I currently live in Dalton, Georgia. And up there, our local chamber, about 8 years ago, started an initiative focused on, how do we, they did an extensive community research, and they looked out, they said, how do we, answer the most pressing needs that our community has? And shortly over a year ago, they launched a subsequent initiative focused solely on housing. And so one thing they found when we talk about income-aligned housing, and this is in Dalton, is that there actually was a wide range of housing at different price points for people in the community. But where they really came up short was at the lowest end and at the highest end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And I'm sure some of you in the room are saying, well, those folks at the highest end of the income level, they can fend for themselves, they don't need to focus on that. But I'll point out, as we're here in a hospital conference room today, that you think about the doctors in a community, and it's a lot harder to retain physicians when they're not living in your community. And so that's just something to keep in mind when you try to come up with housing that fits a wide range of income levels. Going back to the lack of definition on this problem, and Dominic touched on this a little bit as well, but my friends at the American Enterprise Institute Housing Center have what they call the Carpenter Index. And it's based on the ratio of affordability compared to income. And their premise is, can a carpenter afford to live in the home that they're building? And so they use the ratio, the 3-to-1 ratio. So in this instance, it would be if the median household income is $60,000, they can afford a house that's $180,000. And this graph that's on your screen right here was taken in 2012. And in Atlanta at that time, and I apologize, Atlanta's the closest metro market that they do, but close to just over 98% of our theoretical carpenters could afford to live in a home in Atlanta at that time. And green shows how many carpenters can afford to live in the home. You'll see this is true across the country with the exception of areas in coastal California. By 2021, you start to see a lot less green. In Georgia, in Atlanta, that number had dropped to below 37% of our theoretical carpenters can afford to live in the home they build. And they recently updated this data. And in 2023, that number is down to 24%. And you'll see even less green nationwide. So while wages have gone up at that time, housing prices have continued to soar, and no longer can our theoretical carpenter afford to live in the home they build. So we set out to try and quantify a lot of those anecdotes that we were hearing as we talked to stakeholders in the housing community. And some of you may remember I was talking about our study on the cost of government regulation to build a single-family home. I'll go over that again today briefly. And I think at that time we just published our statewide assessment of development impact fees. You'll see here I had it on the timeline when I was here. Since then, we had so much data that came out of the impact fee study, we actually had to publish a second study looking at just some of what we also encountered during the research for that. We went back and we looked at multifamily housing, so apartments, townhomes, and condos. How expensive statewide is it to build those? And then lastly, our most recent research focused on lot size minimums and home size minimums statewide. We're just hearing anecdotally that, my community is looking at a 3 acre or 4 acre, even a 5 acre lot minimum. My community is talking about 2,000 square feet home size minimums. And so we wanted to see just how pervasive that issue actually was statewide. So we modeled our study after what the National Association of Home Builders does. Just some data about that. Let's see. And that's just some data about the survey that we conducted here statewide. And so what we found was, compared to the national average, Georgia was around 3 percentage points higher to build a single family home. So what did we look at there? We looked at the combined federal, state, and local averages, and we surveyed 86 home builders and developers across the state. I'll go into what makes this up a little bit here, but you'll see Georgia is also higher during the construction phase, in addition to the lot development phase. So a few things that were drivers of cost during lot development. You'll see this adds 11.3% total to the overall cost. The most expensive was the hard cost of compliance. That's essentially going down to the local government, permitting fees, utility hookup fees, things like that. The second was land dedicated to the government. That was 3.2% on average statewide. Those are things like when a requirement is done for a park, perhaps to offset a subdivision, or land dedicated for a school, things that the developer cannot, so in essence, they'll drive up the cost for the other lots to offset the land that was dedicated for public use. And overall, these 6 factors added up to, on average, 11.3%. And then building a home slightly higher at 15.6%, that's about 2 percentage points higher than the national average. Both in the state and nationally, the highest driver of cost is changes to the building codes over the last 10 years. It's most often things like energy efficiency standards. And so, I actually was speaking with a group recently and had a manager at a county in Georgia say, well, what about, the savings on things like the AC bill from you're paying more on the front end? And for anyone in the room that's a realtor, I know that's a very tough argument you're trying to make when someone sees a sticker price on a home that you're going to save more on your monthly payments. And especially too, going back to the interest rates. You think about the higher rates, more on the front end adds up more over the cost of 30 years. And so that's the highest cost, but that's not something actually that Georgia has really any impact over, either at the state or local level. It's set, that building code is adopted by the state and then implemented. But those do add up to the cost of building a new home. The second thing is something that anecdotally we were hearing was just Georgia was kind of ground zero for bad regulations. And that is architectural design standards or aesthetic design standards. And so those are things like you'll see local governments, typically in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, they'll institute regulations like no vinyl siding, 4-sided brick requirements, detached garages, window size minimums, things that are purely aesthetic in nature but drive up the cost of a home. And so Georgia builders were nearly 14 points more likely to encounter those than their national counterparts. And then it was it adds 4.1% on average to the cost of a new home in Georgia compared to 2.7% nationally. And the third highest cost here that I'll touch on is, again, additional fees that builders pay. These are utility hookup fees once the home is being built, additional fees to local government, and so those add 2.3% on average. Now, after I've gone over all these percentage points, what does that mean in the real world? Well, on average, we're talking about a $350,000 home. That means that nearly $95,000 is due to the combined cost of federal, state, and local regulation. And the point, I probably should explain this earlier, that, we're not saying that all regulation is bad or should be eliminated, but when you add up to 27%, you think about, if you just take a couple of those regulations and you either, you scale them back a little bit, that adds up to a lot when you're talking about a 30-year mortgage and a 7.25% interest rate right now. And so, for example, here, I just took those percentages, applied them to a $350,000 home. The largest section is those changes to the building codes. Those have added on average nearly $25,000 to the cost of a new home over the last 10 years. As I mentioned, we did a multifamily regulation study since we were here last. We surveyed multifamily developers here in Georgia. A lot of them also work nationwide. And what we found was interesting. Georgia is actually lower than their national counterparts significantly on the regulatory cost to build multifamily housing. That's about 23.4% if I'm looking correctly, compared to 40.6% national average. But it's pretty close in line to what you're seeing with the regulatory cost to build a single family home. My working theory on that is that compared to some of the other kind of larger metropolises, or states with larger metropolitan areas, that we approve so few multifamily housing projects that we actually have, like, the skids are greased necessarily on the front end before they're approved, and you don't see as much of the regulatory barrier in terms of market to entry. What was really interesting that came out of that was when we surveyed the multifamily developers to get some of their typical, when they're trying to build either, apartment buildings or townhomes or condos. So we just asked them point blank, have you ever experienced opposition to multifamily construction? And you'll see that, over 90% of them said yes. One thing that's very popular right now that a lot of local governments are considering, not just in Georgia but around the country, is this concept of inclusionary zoning. So in essence, if you're building 100 apartment units, 20 of those, 20% will be set aside at a certain area median income rental point. The downside of that, however, is that then, developers will then raise the cost of the other 80% of the building units to offset the costs they're losing out there for, to build the units. And so we asked, as local governments consider implementing this, do you avoid building in inclusionary zoning areas? And you'll see that nearly 90% of them said no, we don't. And then 2/3 of them are actually experienced building in areas with inclusionary zoning. However, on the flip side, and this reflects really the fact they don't build outside of Georgia, because Georgia does not allow for rent control. That's a statewide law. But we had asked them if they avoided building in areas with rent control. That's a very popular public policy discussion right now. And 80% of them said yes, they do avoid building in those areas. And I talked about this last time, so I'll be brief. But you're starting to see the discussion about implementing development impact fees occur more statewide. We have about 56 local governments in Georgia that are currently authorized to assess those. We set out to do this because we realized there was not a place where you could just look at what's the actual impact fee from one city or county to another as a comparison tool. What you're seeing on the screen is we took all the single family and multifamily impact fees, cities, counties, towns, and mapped them out. The larger the dot, the darker the dot, the higher the impact fee. You'll see this is not really a prevalent planning tool in middle Georgia. But as I said, other local governments are considering implementing these. I mentioned earlier, and I'll go into this here briefly, is that, there's really a lack of transparency statewide on this. There's probably one or two local governments that actually are saying, hey, we want to create this green space. We want to fund this new library. We're going to, raise the money for this and then sunset the program. The lack of transparency is pretty astonishing statewide. And so that actually ended up being part of our second study that we looked at. But yeah, there's one local government that comes to mind, it's a city in Cobb County. They want to fund a new park. They raise impact fees to do that, and they actually have accounted for, to the penny, the impact fees that are going to that. But they are definitely the exception and not the rule. I've been to Savannah recently talking with them about their housing, and they've implemented an impact fee since we did the first study. There's a lot of misnomers about that problem, misnomers about the policy. People think that it's actually being used to fund affordable housing, so in essence it's subsidizing housing around the community. That's not true at all. It's doing things like funding water and sewer, libraries, road improvements, and so that's one of those things where there's probably a lot of area for education for local governments that are considering implementing those. But in the second study here, what you're seeing on the slide is, I just wanted to provide a perspective for the median household income for a local government compared to what the impact fee was. As I mentioned, the northern Atlanta suburbs are pretty egregious when it comes to this. And so that ratio right there shows, okay, if we're talking about an impact fee, what percentage of that is median household income? And while it may be an $8,000 impact fee per single family home, in some instances an $8,000 impact fee per apartment unit, if you talk to enough builders and developers, the cost added to the housing unit is more than that, because they have to go through the process, they have to carry the loan, construction loan, and so oftentimes you'll end up hearing the builders will pass on the cost 2-3x times an impact fee. So we've just kind of seen these runaway impact fees that leave a lot of room for improvement statewide. The last topic I'll touch on here, as I mentioned anecdotally, we are hearing a lot of local counties, not necessarily locally here, but a lot of counties across the state were considering implementing impact lot size minimums. We wanted to see just how bad those truly were statewide. And so we looked at single family lot sizes across the state. For this, luckily, we have the Department of Public Health standard. It's not required by law, but it's a recommended standard. And in essence, if you're on a septic tank, they recommend a 1 acre lot minimum. If you're on public water, they recommend a ½ acre lot minimum. And so because we have 537 cities in Georgia, we didn't look at each one, but we did look at every county, every city in Metro Atlanta, and every county seat. And you'll see here that above that 1 acre lot standard, we had 31 counties, 8 cities in Metro Atlanta, and 6 county seats. But on the flip side, we actually had it was pretty prevalent that we had a lot of jurisdictions with residential zoning below that standard. So 50 counties, 60 metro Atlanta cities, and 87 county seats. And so when we did this study too, and I have some local data here I'll go into, but when we did this study, we just, a lot of jurisdictions have multiple residential zones, so we just looked at the highest if they had it in place. And so I wasn't really too surprised what I saw when I looked at the local counties and cities here. You'll obviously have a very heavy agricultural tradition. You'll see that a lot of states, a lot of that rural parts of the state where they typically rely on that DPH standard that are more rural. But you'll see the highest lot size minimum in Houston County was actually below the standard. I put this here for Warner Robins because it's also below. And then actually too, if you're on sewer, they have lots below, including below 14,000 feet as well. Perry, below the lot size minimum. Centerville's unique in that my analysts actually found this. They have a septic and well standard compared to just septic. We didn't come across that a lot looking at statewide. But again, it's pretty reasonable. And I put here too, Peach County, I noticed they have done a comprehensive land development resolution. So I don't know if we have any local officials in here today from Peach County, but that was also the rare kind of like, we don't see a lot of those just comprehensive kind of separate documents like that. But you'll see nothing particularly egregious, especially in these like unincorporated parts of the county that have a heavy agricultural tradition. Go back. Okay, it looks like I lost my slide on home size minimums to recap what it was statewide. But there actually isn't an analogous standard for home size minimums like there is lot size minimums. The rule of thumb, and this was going back to the 1950s, is about 1,000 square feet is safe to build a home. So that's what we used for our study. But I wish I had the numbers up here, but most cities and counties do not actually have a home size minimum in their city ordinance or their county ordinance. So that's what the NA shows right there. And then Perry has a residential zone above the safe standards, so just put that there. So this is my last slide, and I'll wrap up and we'll do the panel. But there have been attempts at the state level to try and legislate pro-housing kind of bills in the last 2 years. In 2023, you saw a bill that would have outlawed lot size minimums above the DPH standard, so nothing higher than an acre on septic, nothing higher than a half acre on water and sewer. And you would have seen no lot size minimums higher than 1,200 square feet. And that bill did not even make it out of subcommittee. It was one of the more contentious hearings I've ever sat through. And that was essentially the stick approach to trying to get more housing built. This year there was a carrot approach. There was a list, it was called the Choice Act. It was about 20 different pro-housing policies. Local governments could choose, in essence, 10 of those and get funding from the state based on implementation of those. That also failed to make it out of subcommittee. And so I put this up here. Those were House bills. I put that up there to show that there's not going to be a wholesale state legislative remedy coming anytime soon, I don't believe. And so if you're, as community stakeholders, policymakers, if you're wanting to create housing that's diverse in both the type of housing, whether it's apartments, duplexes, triplexes, single family homes, and you want to do it at different price points, those solutions are going to have to come locally. And so secondly, our next report that's coming out here in a couple months is we're currently looking at what are the housing needs by region. I would love to do it by county based on the jobs and housing units and what we need. I don't know if the data's there for that, but we can definitely do it by region. And part of that comes from, and to Governor Kemp's credit, he's really made an emphasis on putting economic development, large projects outside of Metro Atlanta. What we're seeing, especially when you think of the big three economic development projects at the state level, that's SK of 85, it's Rivian, or whatever Rivian is now going to be, in East Georgia. And then, Hyundai plant down in Bryan County, just outside Savannah. The first thing all those local governments did was put in a no new housing moratorium in place. And so, these communities are saying, well, we're bringing in all these thousands of jobs. Where are these people going to live? And there's kind of what we've traditionally seen in Metro Atlanta, and why you've seen such a growth outside of 285, in terms of, kind of the next county over can take the housing burden. You're starting to see that come to rural Georgia as well. And so really trying to identify what the housing needs are specifically, by region and county. Anyway, this is my contact information. I'll be here on the panel. But if anyone has any questions, any things I'd like to share, my email address up there, cell phone. Anyway, so thank you for your time and look forward to being part of the panel.
All right, we are going to welcome our panel, and using Chris's Carpenter Index and sitting next to Ron Weigel, like the Carpenters say, we've only just begun. We do have an expert panel, and they are going to be joined. I know, right? I couldn't resist. Ron, I got about as many laughs as you usually do, so I guess I'm batting 1,000 here. But I want to welcome our local panelists, Ben Holbert, Market President of Morris Bank, along with Scott Free of Coldwell Banker Free Realty. Sarah Murph is going to manage this panel. She is the CFO of Parish Construction Group and our immediate past chair to really make sense of the data that you've heard. So feel free to refresh your drinks, and I look forward to hearing what you guys unpack for us.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm excited to be here today with you all and unpack those presentations and give some local flavor to how they apply here in Houston County. I think the timing is great, especially on the heels of last week's Eggs and Issues on livability. If you weren't here, we had a great panel of experts that filled us in on what's happening from Perry to Macon and all across our region, and it's a great place to live. And so as the data showed, demand is high, but it sounds like supply is low, right? And so Ben and Scott, I just kind of wanted to start with you guys and get your thoughts. What stood out to you from the data that Dominic and Chris presented, and how do you feel like it plays in Houston County?
I'll go first, and I do feel like I need to get this disclaimer out there. The views expressed are my views as of this moment or subject to change, are not necessarily reflective of Morris Bank, the Development Authority, of the Holberts or Walkers, my friends, or any influencers that I may follow. I think we're in the clear.
Yeah,
anyway, I just first want to say really thank you to Dominic, Chris for coming, and for April, and Arlie, and Sarah, and everybody that's put this together. It's just an awesome topic and something that's super important to all of us. I do work at Morris Bank. I want to recognize the two tables that are Morris Bank tables, and if y'all raise your hands, and I want to especially point out Larry Walker, our board member, Senator Walker, and then Spence Mullis, our CEO. Spence was the man with the plan before there was a plan for Morris Bank in Houston County, and got it going, and it's just been a tremendous supporter. It's fun to work for a bank with somebody who loves Houston County as much as I do, so thank you for that. And then just want to comment, I mean, we touch every parts of housing, I mean, from land loans to development loans, construction loans, single family, multifamily, anything that basically has to do with housing, we're touching. And so this is a very pertinent topic, and I think the big takeaways are, as both of you gentlemen have mentioned, and that is just the lack of inventory is probably the hottest thing. Interest rates are just super in our face every day. We had a pretty positive report yesterday. We're counting on Dominic to keep that going in the right direction. But I look forward to hearing more about things that can help with the inventory issue, and maybe things that we can clear in the way of barriers to that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank y'all for being here. And yeah, these gentlemen gave great information. If I'd have known that, I wouldn't have done so much data myself. I'd have just followed theirs. But what we did with our data is through our MLS system, and they did more of a regional, that included some surrounding counties. And we pulled only data from just Houston County, since we're pretty much speaking to an Houston County group, and that's where the majority of the home sales we have. But, you know, the numbers are pretty relative, real close. And as you will see in your brochure that we put on your table, I mean, we have gone from 2023 to the first quarter of this year in 24, from 20 to 24, our average home sales price over time in 2020 was 203,000, and today they 287,000. So we have had a 41% increase in sales in Houston County in prices, which is tremendous. And last year when we had this panel, all I could do was sit up here and say we need higher density. Well, in studying it, it's hard to do. The price of land, the cost of housing, all the costs that they talked about. We've got great City of Perry, City of Warner Robins, Houston County, great leadership. We've got a very progressive county. And how do we grow with affordable housing to keep it from down the road being a bad market or a blighted area, to keep our values up in this county? And that's a hard decision to make and path to follow. So we're waiting on y'all to tell us what to do.
Thanks. There were great presentations, and I really appreciate both of you coming and doing that and agreeing to do the panel with us today. I want to talk, Dominic, to you about your presentation. You had a slide that was hard to see on the screen, but it was about core inflation and shelter being a main component of that. On the slide, it showed an average over that 28-month period of 6.6% with shelter, with June showing 5.2. Going back, I looked at a 15-year span on that data leading up to December 2019, so kind of pre-pandemic. And I only saw one 6-month period where shelter was ever above 4%. That was September of 2006 to February 2007. And the average for that 15-year period was 2.54. So with that context, that 5.2% is inordinately high, right? And how concerned is the Fed with that persistently high shelter component and its impact on core inflation?
Is my mic on? Can you hear me? Shelter makes up about, I think it's about 30 or 40% of inflation. So it's a significant part of inflation. And so the Fed, you read any statement from the, or hear any statement that comes from any member of the FOMC, you know, it's part of our strategy to try to get that to be more normalized. The challenge with monetary policy, anyone that will talk to you about monetary policy, anyone who's engaged in monetary policy, will tell you that it's a blunt instrument, right? It's not something that you can sort of, it's not like a precise instrument where, well, we want to target shelter, so that's how do we create monetary policy that gets shelter specifically down. So it's more like a mallet that you just sort of hammer until you get the results that eventually you want to get. And sometimes it causes some, when you're trying to resolve broad issues with inflation, it causes some challenges in other areas. And so, yes, we're trying to get inflation down by raising interest rates, but higher interest rates makes housing less affordable. So it is a challenge. So it is very important. Shelter inflation has been the highest it's ever been in a long time, ever since the pandemic. Part of that's because, remember, the shelter component really includes rent and owner's equivalent of rent. It doesn't include mortgage payments. That's sort of because you got to think if someone gets a mortgage, they're locked in. So they're not really, the mortgage payments don't change with fluctuations in the economy because people are able to lock in their mortgage for the most part. And so we're just talking about rents, and if you're, or what an owner would pay for rent if they rented their house. And so those costs have gone up significantly since the pandemic, and it's because of the same reason that home prices have gone up. We just don't have enough rental inventory. And to add to the matter, I think you, Chris may have mentioned, or someone mentioned, there is an increase in, now it's overblown the significant fact of it, but in some areas, there has been a significant increase in institutional investors coming in and buying homes specifically to use as rental properties. And they've seen extraordinary growth over the past few years. And in fact, because there's not enough existing inventory to buy, to keep as rental inventory, there's been a big growth in build to rent. So it's developers that are building a new family subdivision where all the units are in that subdivision are rentals. And part of it is it's an alternative for, you know, building apartments in more rural areas that maybe have some stipulations against apartment developments. So build to rent is becoming sort of an alternative. So it's a significant challenge. It all goes back to inventory. It's not something that the Fed has a direct impact on. But it is something that we're aware of and very concerned about. And hopefully, as the monetary policy that we implemented over the past few years continues to work its way out through the economy, we'll see rate inflation come down.
Right. And we want this to be like a conversation, a fireside chat. So jump in if anybody has a follow-up question. But I do. So, Chris, you had some great points there about the statewide decrease in building permits and even locally, a building permit decrease over the last decade of 15%, while residents increased 15%. That just compounds that supply issue, right? And this is kind of a general panel question, but I hear a lot of times people say, oh, well, prices are just too high, I'm gonna wait it out. And how they're familiar with what happened out of the Great Recession. Could y'all, anybody, compare and contrast how different these times are to what we experienced with the last market reset?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Great Recession, because that did have an effect in decimating the number of building permits, because we lost so many builders overall in the industry in the Great Recession. But you know, one thing that I often hear is, you know, how do we keep folks from moving in, either from out of state, out of the region? And you know, one thing that comes to mind when I often hear that is, if they're coming from California or New York, they have a lot more buying power than people in Georgia do. And so if you don't keep up with housing production, it's typically the, you know, kind of your fourth, fifth, sixth generation, you know, family, whether it's, you know, someone that has that third child needs to buy a larger home, whether it's the empty nesters looking to downsize. And, you know, if you have significant buying power coming in from out of state, you're gonna be able to afford a home. And so that's why kind of this thing we talk about, this like diversity of housing, is so important, because it creates those different price points and people at different affordability levels and, you know, different facets of life.
One thing I'll add, if you look during the, prior to the great financial crisis, the majority of new home construction nationally was below $250,000. If you look right before the pandemic, in 2019, about 40% of all homes, new homes that were being built, were less than 300. So prices had increased, but not that much. Today, it's less than 10%. So we don't have the capacity to build what is traditionally considered entry-level or starter home product almost anywhere in the country because of the increase in costs. It's everything that Chris mentioned, in addition to labor, lumber, land costs. Everything is far more expensive. So one of the reasons why we don't have as much new home construction is because if you think about once you move down in price point, there's always going to be a much larger market. And when you move up in price point, the market gets smaller. So a builder who is building starter homes below in the high ones isn't going to build as many homes in the high and mid threes, just because the market is much smaller. And so one of the impacts of higher costs is it's just the market gets smaller and it's just less capacity to build, product where there's greater demand for it.
And Ben, you could probably speak to, it really also just has to do with capital, right? So those developers might have a limited amount of capital to build houses, so you can build a lot more $100,000 houses than you can 300, right?
There's certainly a capital limitation, and I think there's still, I don't know, I believe it or not, I actually worked during the Great Recession.
Me
Was
too.
old enough, right? Yeah. But, I did, and there's still scars. People remember that, and just the gluttony of lots and houses out there that just could be sold, and so there's some memory of that, and then, just comparing that to where we are today, people say, well, you just need more houses. It's not a funding issue. We're making loans. I wish it weren't this way. There's a few other banks in town, that are making loans. There's funding available, but it's just, when you go back to just, if you time, like the time somebody buys a piece of land, the time they get all the approvals and get it developed and turn it into a finished house where somebody can buy. In today's world, that's probably at least a 3-year process. And so you combine that with interest rates that are in the whatever people are charging these days, but 8 plus 9, whatever it is, it doesn't work. The dynamics don't work because of the time it takes.
Scott, you might not have data on this. I might have already asked you this, but one of the feelings that I have is that I feel like a lot of excess lots from the recession, at least in our area, have been being absorbed over the last decade. And I think they're pretty much gone, right? And so the new developments that are being put in place, how do we feel about the clip at which that's happening? Is it anywhere close to what is needed to fill the supply?
No, you're right. The excess available lots they're not here. We're looking for lots, developers from all over the state and some outside the state, national builders. I talked to some last week. They looking for lots, and they don't want to come in and buy the land, build the subdivision out. They want to buy both pad-ready lots. We don't have any. There's not any to be bought. The developers that are building lots are typically, some of the bigger developers, they're putting in a good bit of lots right now, but they already have builders lined up and spoken for them. Some of your bigger builders have bought land and they've built out some of the developments and are moving into a new one they're starting. But there's not just lots laying around for buyers, for developers to buy. No.
Just a follow-up question. Do you think, from what I understand, the lot development isn't as profitable, the margins aren't there.
Right.
And so is that, my understanding, that's why most builders, if they need lots, they'll just build them themselves versus having a developer develop them because the margins just don't make it possible.
A lot of those developers, builders think they want to get development business, and some do well at it, but some of them realize that the developer's not making as much as they thought they were making, because the cost of development has gone up tremendously. And even though the lot prices where it may used to be 40,000, today is 60,000, the margins are still the same. The profit margin is still the same, or maybe even less. But we're running behind, and everybody knows we got a lack of shortage of homes. And even though our average new construction is $333,000 that is selling in our MLS, about on an average about $160 a foot. We're relatively cheap compared to other parts of the state of Georgia, but we're not the only ones facing this. I was meeting with Builders First Source this morning on some other matters, and one of the guys from Builders First Source was from Vidalia. They have the same meetings we're having about lack of houses, mainly from the Hyundai plant in that area, in that market. The pricing, where I feel like with interest rates, hopefully by the end of the year, are going to lower a little bit, but then we're going to be a lack of houses. I think it's going to drive the price of housing up even higher. That's my opinion.
Well, so it's possible.
Debatable,
Well,
yeah.
So you have two things moving at the same time. So lower interest rates will increase demand. At the same time, it also will unlock some supply. So people who are saying, if I have a 3% mortgage, there's no way I'm gonna sell at 7%, but maybe I'll think about selling at 5%. And so you will have sort of an increase in supply, and there's probably some built-up supply there for people who just were sitting and couldn't sell because rates were too high. So it might balance itself out, but most likely you will see a spike in demand, and that may cause some upward pressure on price, but we'll see.
Maybe another question for you, Scott or Ben. Have you seen a change in consumer behavior or your commercial customer behavior? The data that we're seeing typically lags just a little bit. And so I was speaking with a group in Atlanta, and a mortgage broker in there said she just happened to notice that this month the calls have kind of dropped off, and another realtor in the group said that what they've noticed is an uptick in pending sales kind of falling apart. And I don't know if that's just reflective of something happened in Metro Atlanta, or has there been any changes here locally this summer?
This summer has relatively been consistent from last year to this year. We're 41 units up as in MLS over last year from January through July, into July. But in the last several weeks, we are seeing some of the pendings because of different reasons fall out. But a lot of those aren't just dropping out of the market. We keep in earnest money, and then they move into a different house, whether it's home inspections or whatever the case may be. But it has slowed up a little in the last few weeks, and I don't know whether it's people pin up or trying to decide what's happening with interest rates, if they want to wait on that, if school's kicking back off, whatever reason.
Been any local changes you've noticed?
Nothing really to add to that. I mean, and I don't want to just move from the topic, but I do think I would like to go back to Chris's presentation. I think the thing that jumped off the page for me in his report is, 26.8% of just being the cost of regulation, in a house, because that's ultimately what, from just a community perspective, we want the house, the value of the house to be, in the house, not in a bunch of weird, costs along the way. I mean, if, people want the cost of the house to be in granite countertops, or maybe one of those, maybe hardwood floors, or one of those ice makers that make the ice like they have at Waffle House.
No, nice.
Yeah, anyway, just the good stuff, right? Not fees, and not, there was a cost of delay component to that, which is a big deal. That would be the interest, where the interest rates are captured, and just delays, and I think from just a local perspective, I mean, where we have had success as a bank, and a lot of other service industry people have, is all in the responsive piece. And so, when you're dealing with local government or whatever, and we have awesome cities and the county, but I mean, so the inspector coming back out there today versus coming out there in 2 weeks, it makes a difference in the grand scheme. And there's probably 100 examples like that along the process, and the end result is the homeowner just has less in their house, or less value in their house, than they otherwise would have because of the cost of regulation.
So, switching gears just a little bit, there was a CNN poll Monday that showed 86% of current renters in the U.S. would like to buy a home and can't afford one. And among those same renters, 54% think they'll never be able to afford one. Unsurprisingly, the polling showed that younger renters are those most impacted by a lack of entry-level homes, which matches the data that we've seen this morning. I did get permission to share this little tidbit of information, but something that the school system has noticed here in Houston County, they have been putting together some data regarding student populations for elementary, middle, and high school since the pandemic, and they wanted to see what kind of trends they were noticing. And something that was a surprise to them was that they have had a net decrease in students at the elementary and middle school level, while adding over 700 students at the high school level. And the only kind of conclusion they could draw is that they think we might be attracting more mature families to Houston County, and that maybe young families can't afford to live here. And I think that could line up with exactly what you guys have presented. But thoughts on that and kind of that renter perspective, that high shelter, young family kind of priced out of the market?
You know, I agree with everything about that regarding, you know, renting, and I do think it's much more a factor of, you know, despite what sociologists may conclude, I think it's much more a factor of affordability than I do think it is like, you know, certain generations would just prefer to rent than actually own a home, right? And so I had not actually heard anecdotally anything like that of kind of where families were skewing older in terms of the children when they move in here, but I could definitely see that being the case.
Yeah, I would agree. Like everything that I've seen suggests that people who there isn't sort of a big change in people's desire to own a house. That's still sort of the way that households are able to generate wealth, pass on wealth to future generations. There's some tax benefits of owning a house, you know, and so people want to own. And I hear a lot from single-family renters, investors that suggest that people don't want to own a house. It's easier to rent. You know, someone else takes care of the maintenance. And it's like, I really want to ask them whether you rent your house. You know, you know, because people generally know that in America, that's sort of the way that you build generational wealth is through home ownership. So that really hasn't changed. I agree. It's right now it's an affordability issue. People are generally, if you look a generation ago, the age of first-time home buyers, when a household bought their first home was much younger than it is today. Today, people are buying their first house in their early 30s, early to mid-30s versus in their 20s. And that's partly a factor of people are staying in school longer, they're having to get, you know, higher level of education to get a higher job. So the trigger for buying a house is starting a family, and because of the way our economy is going, you know, people tend to start families a little bit later because of education and some other barriers. So they're buying houses later, but they still want to buy if they can.
And think too about the Carpenter Index. I mean, it's the median household income for a reason. And so you think in the span of a decade, you're going from nearly, you know, over 98% of people at the median household income being able to afford a home and 3 times their income level to just under a quarter of the same people making the median household income. I mean, that clearly has an effect on people's ability to buy a home, and I think that says a lot right there.
Okay, final question before we do wrap up. Creative solutions. This is a national problem. We're actually the most affordable in the state, so we have the opportunity to be proactive and consider what the future looks like for us as a community. What have you seen in other areas, and what have you seen, have you seen creative solutions to tackle the issue?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple things that come to mind. I've seen some communities that implement like a UPUD, where they want to go to below a certain, honestly have like a tiny home kind of planned development, but they put aesthetic restrictions on there. So you're creating more housing units, but you're also keeping in line with the character of the community. I think one really neat thing up in Gainesville that they did was they partnered with a local developer, and you think about the school system. A lot of times schools have like 1 or 2 acres of coal lots around the building, and they actually were doing housing for teachers, and they'd rent out at below market rates in Gainesville to kind of create that primary workforce for teachers. And then, the other thing that comes to mind too is, and it's something that, Scott was touching on earlier, in fact, take on one hand the cost to develop lots or develop a subdivision. On the other hand, you think about Houston County and this region generally, a very strong agricultural presence. You probably want to factor more on how do we do infill redevelopment. And so you'll see some jurisdictions, for example, that will implement by right zoning reform in residential districts. So for example, you can tear down one single-family home and build a duplex or a triplex. And you know, sometimes in the presentation I'll have pictures of what these look like. You walking on the street, you'd never know it wasn't a single-family home. But they're addressing those housing unit needs and maintaining the character of the neighborhood. So those are just a couple things that come to mind.
Yes, so there are some demand side solutions and supply side solutions. So on the demand side, how do you make housing more affordable to a household making the median income? And so the thing that drives the market and drives affordability, unfortunately, is interest rates. And so I remember during the pandemic, I was seeing, you know, people buying houses for $400,000 or $500,000 that I know didn't make $400,000 or $500,000 kind of money. But the interest rates were 3%. They could buy whatever they wanted to buy. And so what I've seen now for the majority of a good portion of the builders that are selling houses now, they're not selling to sort of repeat buyers that have an existing house to sell. The entry-level buyers are a significant part of the market because they don't have a house to sell. And so they're sort of capturing a greater market share. It's not that it's a great time to buy for a first-time buyer. It's just that they're just capturing greater market share. And in order for builders to get those people into a house at 7% interest rates, they're having to buy down the rate. And so I've heard stories. There's a builder in Atlanta that spends about $30,000 to $35,000 per house to buy down the interest rate to about 5% or so to make the housing more affordable. And I think this is indicative of, if you think about those components of affordability, you know, I don't know what we can do about home prices. We don't have much control about much control of incomes, but you can neutralize interest rates by creating some way to sort of buy down the rate. So the rate now doesn't become a barrier for someone to buy. The other thing on the supply side, you know, if you think about how many homes we build nationally a year at our peak, maybe it's about 1 million homes, maybe a little bit over 1 million homes. Well, the mass majority of housing inventory that we have in America is existing home inventory. And the way the fastest way to create existing home inventory, is to create greater churn in inventory. So more people who are willing to sell, downsize, upsize, or whatever, that's going to unleash more inventory than anything else. And right now, especially since the Great Recession, the barrier for inventory churn has been this persistently low interest rates. So people, when interest rates are low, people refinance. They don't want to, and then interest rates go up. Now there's sort of that rate lock effect. If we can find a way, some innovative way to not make rates an issue, either on the buy side or not make rates an issue for existing homeowners. I don't know if the rates can be portable. You can take it when you buy a new house. I don't know. I've heard people talk about solutions like that. There has to be some way to sort of neutralize the interest rate effect in buying or selling a house. The other quick things I'll mention is I've heard there's some innovative solutions. If you want to think about the most affordable part of the country, is on the West Coast in California. So there's sort of the epicenter of all of these kind of ideas to create affordability. One idea that I've heard is sort of fractional ownership, where the state has implemented this, but there's also been investors that have been involved in this too, where they would, in order for you to get to that 20% down payment, they will give you equity investment into your house, so you maybe you have put 5%, the investor puts 15%, they give you 20% down payment, so you can have that conventional mortgage, so that lowers the cost. I've also heard, particularly in all along the West Coast, there is a growing trend of accessory dwelling units. So essentially, you know, you're able to build on your existing property. You're able to build a smaller house that acts as a rental property, and not only does it increase rental inventory, but also offsets the cost of owning the house. So it creates some income for the homeowner. So those are sort of some market innovations that are happening in different places. Not saying that those things would necessarily work here, but that's some of the ideas we're seeing.
And as they call an accessory dwelling unit in Savannah, I carriage house. So,
Carriage
carriage
house,
houses.
Granite Flats, I've heard, yes, a lot of different names.
Scott, are you seeing creativity in the developers locally already to make things work, or?
Well, we're seeing a townhouse development that's, a couple of them that are being looked at and developed. But I still think we're gonna need some smaller, whether it's a tiny house, whether it's some smaller, higher density, single family dwellings for the home dream of having their own house in their backyard, starting a family that's affordable. I really hate to see, and I did not know it until today, that there's minimum square footage being set as a mandatory square footage. I don't know all the details to that, but you know, if you're sitting on a 1,500 square foot house at $200 a foot, I mean, you have a minimum of $300,000. But I do think with if you do let some smaller developments in size, we do need some stronger regulations, and other than just homeowner association, we need some regulations set by the cities and counties to keep the values up.
And you'd probably love to finance that, it just, the rate's gotta be right. Okay, so I just wanna give you the opportunity to give any final thoughts, and we'll close. Start with you, Chris, and end with our locals.
No, I think there's, clearly, you know, by the presence of everyone in the room today, this panel, there's a lot of involvement. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, kind of investment in making sure y'all get this right. And, you know, those solutions I just outlined are kind of my closing thoughts, but I'll just take this opportunity to say thank you for the opportunity to be with y'all here today.
Yes, the only thing that I say so as a closing thought is I think the housing market is prime for innovations. Whether that's on the sales side, the financing side, the construction side, we're in a situation now where making the median income is not enough to afford to be a homeowner. And that's not just here, that's across the country. And our economy has historically worked in America in that if you work hard and you make that median income, then it is very possible for you to be a homeowner. That's just no longer the case. You have to make, you know, in a market like Atlanta, you have to make at least $120,000 before you can buy the median price house. That's never been the case anymore. So in order for us to solve this, we're going to have to think about really ways to innovate how we do housing. If you want to connect with us at the Atlanta Fed, we'd love to keep in touch with you. At the back of my presentation, there's a QR code. You can scan that and register, and we'll love to keep in touch and send you any updates from any information we have. Thanks again. Thanks, April, for having us.
Scott, final thoughts from you?
Well, I just wanted to thank y'all for y'all's professional opinion and for coming. Thank y'all for asking the questions. Thanks to Chamber for holding this. Y'all do a great job. Ben gave a 10-minute commercial. I'm just going to give a 1-minute commercial. I want to thank. I've got a couple of tables of agents and staff and wife all here. They'd be glad to answer any of your real estate questions. And there's a lot of real estate companies here, which are all knowledgeable of the market. But thank y'all for hosting this. Thanks for letting us be a part. Thank you.
It's a room full of partners, and we just appreciate you more than I can express. And just thank you so much, and we're here to help.
Thank you all. I did want to make one correction. I noticed that it showed, Chris, that you're the mayor of Brunswick. That would be Cosby Johnson in the pamphlet, but equally impressive. And I just want to thank you all for coming. I'm sure April will close it out, but I think we have a great story to tell here in Houston County. As Ben said, we do have a room full of partners, and we have wonderful leadership at the county and city levels, and it makes it a great place to live, work, and play. And so I appreciate all of you and all the realtors in the room and mortgage bankers for coming and listening today.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Let's give our panel a round of applause. I got to less than 2 minutes, so y'all hang tight just a second. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for what you do each and every day to make this the fantastic place it is to live, work, play, pray, run a business, and raise a family. Just a couple of closing notes. It's a busy season for the Chamber and all of our partners across Middle Georgia. Kids are back in school, praise the Lord. But it also means that it's time for us to do some of our annual events. On the 15th of this month, we will be hosting our joint business after hours with the Macon Chamber at Middle Georgia State's Macon campus. We would love to see you guys there. There's a QR code to register on the screens, and then we will be back here the following Thursday, the 22nd, speaking of education, with Dr. Scott, getting an update on all of the great things happening in our Houston County School District. There are a lot of materials on your table, and I want to tell you what you've got before you leave, both in your program with the misprint as well as the table tents. There is a QR code that works. It went live about 11:45. It has links to all of the presentations you saw today, along with a digital version of this lovely handout provided to us by Coldwell-Banker Free Realty. So make sure you either take the program with you or scan that QR code before you go. You also have some goodies from Coldwell-Banker Free Realty and Sugar Mama Sweets cookies. Provided cookies for today, so make sure you grab those, and we let her think there's no place like home. We're all happy to live here. There's a QR code on the back. Today's the day of the QR code. If you're interested in having these made for your organization, Sabrina would love to talk to you about that. Guys, thank you for being here. Talk to somebody you don't know, and as you leave your name tag on this table or the one on the way out. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.